Well, thank you, Tom, for the kind words of introduction. And my apologies for forcing you to read in French. I mean, the book is being translated as we speak, so eventually people will be able to read it. And so I will no longer have to inflict 500 pages of academic French onto anyone on this side of the pond. I should add, I'm delighted to be here today and to be back on campus. I had the privilege of organizing a workshop here that gave rise to the Umayyad Legacies volume with Paul Cobb, 2005, I think, so pre-Diluvian, but something like that. So it's good to be back. And thank you, Mohamad and Tom, for thinking of me and inviting me to contribute and reflect on Mohamad's work. So as I understand it, rightfully or not, my remit in the first part of this symposium is to reflect on some of the themes developed by Mohamad in his work and to try to connect it somehow to my own scholarship. So that's what I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes, and I'll save some more specific comments for this afternoon. How do we chiefly remember Ibn al-Khatib? As a poet, as a man of letter, as an influential scholar and powerful statesman, all of the above, but probably not as a physician. And yet, it's precisely in this capacity as physician that he had direct access to rulers. Such a direct access gave Ibn al-Khatib an advantage over many competing cultural brokers and was likely decisive in securing and maintaining his eminent position at the Nasrid court. I mean, the connection with the Black Death that Mohamad just pointed out is yet further evidence. Whether or not Ibn al-Khatib primarily considered himself a physician might be impossible to tell, and that's too far away from my own area of expertise, which is early Islam. And yet, this is how he described his return to Granada upon Muhammad V's restoration to the throne. He says, and I'm quoting him as quoted by Mohamad, "I went to Granada in the manner of a physician approaching his moribund patient, for the kingdom had whole but collapsed." So I think that one of the great merits of Mohamad's work here is to highlight Ibn al-Khatib the polymath, to look at the full range of his tremendous scholarly achievements, accomplishments. That actually applies to both Ibn al-Khatib and Mohamad, but I was thinking Ibn al-Khatib first here. And Mohamad walked a fine line between the scholar and the politician, between the scribe of the Alhambra, Granada, and the Nasrid dynasty. And the challenge, as you pointed out in your conclusion, is partly to find how to best tell those entirely intertwined stories and how to question some of our modern categories along the way, categories that tend to obscure part of the intellectual profile of medieval scholars. Again, do we pay enough attention to the many hats of those scholars? Do we pay enough attention to Ibn al-Khatib, the physician? And here, I mean, there will be a much broader conversation, but I think the gap between not just intellectual history and other scholarly approaches, but especially between history of science and cultural history and historiography in particular, this is a difficult gap to bridge, but it's an important one. The central notion of Mohammad's discussion is to envision Ibn al-Khatib and his peers as scholar officials, postulating the rise of a distinct class of scholar officials in late medieval Spain. Now, the category of scholar officials is familiar to historians of China. Shi Da Fu, I don't know Chinese, so I'm butchering it, but that's actually the term. And those two terms, scholar and officials, were combined starting with the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century BCE and lasted all the way to the collapse of the Qing Dynasty in 1912. So we're talking more than 2 millennia during which the terminology was in use here. So very familiar to Chinese historians, to sinologists, much less so to Islamicists. In fact, what would be the proper category in Arabic? We are accustomed to think in terms of kutab, secretaries, of ulama, religious scholars. Maybe, we could have a few more. Dhul Wizaratain is one of the nicknames of Ibn al-Khatib, the bearer of the two ministries, that is the chancery and the vizierate. So here there is some more discussion that will be helpful to think about how to apply, how to use a category developed in another field. And I think it has a lot of value. It has a tremendous heuristic value, if nothing else, because this is coming, this is a scholar official calling, I'm sure. It has tremendous value, if nothing else, because here, Mohamad, you're not falling guilty of what all of us are doing. By default, we compare with the medieval West. It's probably the wrong place to say this, but it makes sense to look east towards India and China. So I really appreciate that, and that really, you really got me thinking here. There are many questions that I don't have time to address that now, but in particular, the question of the absence of a formal curriculum, the absence of a formal imperial examination is an obvious difference here. And again, the point you just made about the absence of college in Granada and of the chancery being the place defining education really is something that is extremely interesting in that regard. Now, I would argue for people like myself, for early Islamicists, for specialists of the first centuries of Islam, the difficulty of thinking with the category of scholar officials is particularly acute. And I would say, taking a few shortcuts here, that this has to do with a tension between two towering figures, Al-Tabari, who died in the early 10th century, and Ibn Khaldun, that was already mentioned. Let me explain. Ibn Khaldun famously wrote about the fruitful alliance of the sword and the pen that gave Muhammad his title. Ibn Khaldun tells us that the sword entirely dominates at the beginning of a dynasty, when power has to be conquered. And the sword still dominates on the verge of the collapse of a dynasty, when power has to be defended. In between, however, it is the pen that takes precedence, and scholars thus rise to preeminence. A great way to think about the rise and fall of Ibn al-Khatib here, and his demise in particular, I suppose. Interestingly enough, even though Ibn Khaldun in that very passage, very, very famous for anyone who has ever read the Muqaddimah, and certainly, you know, anyone who has received an education in Arabic will know those lines. In that specific passage, only a couple of paragraphs, Ibn Khaldun actually refers to a specific comment made by Abu Muslim to Al-Mansur, the Abbasid Caliph, the early Abbasid Caliph. And yet, early Islamicists have not really been comfortable engaging with this tension between, or relationship between the sword and the pen. One example is enough. A very obvious figure of early Islam, Al-Zuhri, who dies 742 CE, we have much modern scholarship trying to pretend that Al-Zuhri was not connected to the Umayyad caliphs, that he was some kind of an independent scholar. Of course, that doesn't work. That doesn't, that's not a sustainable argument. It really is against the evidence. So again, I'm taking a few shortcuts here in the interest of time, but I think this difficulty is perhaps best explained by the most famous historian of early Islam, Al-Tabari, who dies 923 CE. Indeed, as often when it comes to the first centuries of Islam, Al-Tabari's shadow, long shadow, I should say, looms large. We are told that Al-Tabari consistently refused to serve in any official capacity, and that he rather operated as, we would say today, as an independent scholar, living off the revenues of a family estate, among other things. In other words, the Tabarization of history, pointed out by Fred Donner, has implications not only in terms of content, but also with regard to categories. In particular, it makes the alliance of the pen and the sword difficult to envision, almost unthinkable when it comes to early Islam, even though many other, perhaps most other, early Islamic era scholars were active at the court in some capacity. More broadly, we are back to the limitation of our modern categories and to some academic silos when it comes to defining scholars that count as historians. I would suggest that we are facing a problem of classification of historiographical genres. Islamic historiography has been reduced to three main categories, best discussed by Chase Robinson in the book you see on the slide: chronography, tarikh, biography, sirah, and prosopography. A considerable amount of scholarly attention, has been devoted to these genres, though they've been treated quite unevenly, and much more remains to be done for each of them. This surge of academic research has certainly helped us better map the gigantic puzzle that Islamic historiography constitutes. And yet, it has also created a distorted prism, as several alternative modes of historical writings were ignored and discarded along the way. Even though many such alternative modes of historical writing could be discussed, astrology, or more aptly, astrological histories, offer the most egregious case, as I'll try to show in the remaining minutes. Much could be said, by the way, about the close links between medicine and astrology. Practitioners of both disciplines, if nothing else, shared a direct access to the ruler. In light of the tight connection between Ibn al-Khatib and Granada, and even the Alhambra Palace, what should we say of Nawbacht, Masha'Allah, and possibly others? The sources disagree here. That is the astrologers, or court astrologers, that cast the founding horoscope of Baghdad that you see on the slide. The role of these astrologers is a reminder of their centrality in early Islam, at least, and probably much, much beyond that. No city was founded without a horoscope. No battle was launched without military astrology. I could go on. Fittingly for our conversation, like Ibn al-Khatib much later, early Islamic era court astrologers played a significant role towards the construction of the past. This intimate relationship between astrology and history should not surprise us for several reasons. Astrologers were ideally suited for the job because they were experts of the various calendars at work in the Middle East. As masters of computation and astronomical cycles, they were also masters of time and chronology. Astrology was, moreover, a powerful tool to provide links of historical causality in a systematic effort to align heaven and earth. Finally, and perhaps more importantly, astrology was authoritative because it provided a scientific method, something that is often hard to grasp for us as modern, postmoderns, whatever we are. The basic principle of an astrological history presupposes that celestial bodies have an impact on earthly matters. Various possibilities can be considered by astrologers, ranging from a vast array of celestial omens to eclipses or planetary conjunctions. On top of different theories, astrological histories also take many forms, and I won't go into the specifics here of horoscopes and their different shapes. Just perhaps an interesting connection to think about here. Come back to this. Most horoscopes that survive look like this: square diagrams, unknown to the Greco-Roman world. They come from Chinese magic squares from Central Asia. So here we are, an interesting connection with China, as we were talking about that earlier. The most distinctive characteristic of Arabic astrological histories is arguably the central role given to the conjunctions of the superior planets, in particular Saturn and Jupiter. These conjunctions are first and foremost used to justify or predict major religious or political changes. Early Abbasid era astrologers' approach to world history is provided by a Sasanian theory that important religious and political changes are indicated by conjunctions of the planets Saturn and Jupiter, which recur at intervals of about 20 years. Successive conjunctions tend to say in the same astrological triplicity, the triplicity being a group of 3 signs of the zodiac belonging to the same elements, so fire or earth, air, water. After a long time, however, what you see here, over 2 centuries, about 240 years, they move along into another triplicity. Any such shift of triplicity indicates changes of a more sweeping nature than a simple conjunction, For instance, the rise of a new dynasty, the advent of a major prophet, an event most portentous of all, is heralded by the completion of a cycle of shifts through all four triplicities, about 960 years total, and predictions are made by casting the horoscope for the vernal equinox of each year in which a conjunction or shift occurs. I was just here quickly summarizing the work of historians of science who have analyzed this for us, especially David Pingree and Edward Kennedy. To put it simply, such theories translate into horoscopes and horoscopes into history. Here you see, mashallah, a Jewish astrologer and his horoscope of the Abbasid revolution. By the way, this is not a figment of his imagination, so he correctly points the conjunction between Saturn and Jupiter. If you just reconstruct the event of that night with modern softwares, it's perfectly correct. In fact, the slide is slightly wrong here because modern softwares are not using the same astronomical tables. I'll skip the details, but it's absolutely correct. Both planets were in conjunction. In fact, using his math and not our math, they were actually even closer. Now, those horoscopes, we have, I didn't take the time to discuss the corpus. We're dealing with a very large corpus of thousands of such historical horoscopes like this one here. And with at least 15 preserved astrological histories for the early Islamic period alone, many of them, like this guy, is active about a century prior to Al-Tabari. Let's let that sink in. We have much earlier sources than we claim. I mean, early Islamicists like to lament the dearth of early sources. It's because of our categories, because we don't want to look at, to count this as historiography. It's also because of the eventual demise of the genre. It's also because eventually astrological histories vanished, at least for a while. Not astrology itself. Astrology itself never vanished. But this form of historical writing came to an end for a while around the 10th century CE. This trend reveals the demise of astrologers as arbitrators of historical knowledge. Religious scholars, for lack of a better category, but also legal scholars, traditionists, and here again, we will need a longer conversation, eventually confiscate historical writing and imposed hadith-based methodologies, especially with the adoption of chains of transmissions, or isnads. Authoritative historical discourse was pulled into the field of religious sciences, if you will. To make sense of this evolution, one possible explanation has to do with a shift at the level of historical causality, as astrological history seems to have largely vanished to the benefit of theocentric histories. I'll skip a bit in the interest of time to just show you one last bit. So eventually astrological histories came to an end and vanished. And yet, I would argue that significant invisible legacies of this moment in historical writing endured. Full oblivion of these astrological histories was indeed impossible, as the starting point of historiography is never silence, but what has been said already. So astrological links of causality were indeed erased. Heaven was still ruling history, but it was no longer the same heaven, as the sky of astrologers was replaced by the firmament of theologians. Astrological histories were eventually forgotten, and yet they nevertheless left an indelible mark on historical writing. And their impact is best seen at the level of chronology. So I'll just give you one example here to wrap up. There is quite a bit of discussion about how the agreed upon chronology of early Islam came about. I can refer you, for instance, to Fred Donner's work and what he has to say about how we've transitioned from relative dating, like the year of the elephant, to absolute dating. That's where my guys, that's where the astrologers come into play and are particularly interesting because they are the masters of computation. So certainly they were not the only one. We have to imagine, and that's very central to Mohamad's discussion, cultural brokers in competition. And so others, like Al-Zuhri I mentioned earlier, were of course trying to come up with a chronology. But astrologers had an advantage. They could use mathematical astronomy to do that. The theoretical model I outlined above, revolving around Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions every 20 years or so, created a very binding, very rigid framework. And we have some evidence of the manipulation of chronology when needed. For instance, they shifted the flood to a watery signs because, of course, that's what you would expect when it comes to the deluge. But let's ignore pre-Islamic chronology. There will be a long discussion. Just focus on early Islamic times. And look at this. 571, Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. 610, Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. 630, Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. 749, Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. 809, I could go on. That is, for anyone who has studied early Islam, this is a basic chronology we're still using today. Let me rephrase. Birth of the Prophet, first revelations, death of the Prophet, Abbasid revolution, fourth fitna. I could go on. You have the entire agreed upon chronology we're still using today. So there will be a lot more to be said beyond chronology, but in the book I am, I guess, not writing right now, you need to extend those fellowships to people post anyway. There is more to be said, but one of the arguments I'm trying to make is that the chronology we still use today, but rarely questioned, was constructed by astrologers. You could take one step further. In so doing, they were also selecting sites of memory. They were also selecting episodes worth remembering that shaped every subsequent layers of history writing. So let's wrap up. Scholar officials, is that a meaningful category already in early Islamic times? I understand Muhammad is making a different argument about the emergence of a class in the late medieval Islamic West. Well, my guys, most of those court astrologers were in some way, they kind of fit partly this definition of scholar officials with a few caveats. At the very least, asking whether a Chinese category applies or is helpful heuristically to think about what we think we know about early Islam is really helpful to help us to redeem alternative modes of history writing that have been either forgotten or neglected. It also shows that we're dealing with competing forms of legitimation. Here, astrology was the causal factor, and eventually it was erased, but the chronology endured. For Muhammad, genealogy becomes, again, it's not the first time. And as you're saying, you can, with Himyar, you can at least go back to the 9th century CE, but you have another form, which is not the kind of hadith-based, model we're used to when it comes to early Islam. And in that sense, I think that the vanishing of histories, the vanishing of alternative pasts and memories is ultimately historically explainable, but their legacies need to be acknowledged. This is not to say that the construction of the past should be entirely restricted to scholar officials, of course, but rather than trends such as what, and again, I'm borrowing this from Muhammad's discussion, trends such as what Thomas Bauer has described as the adabization of the ulama and the ulamaization, whatever that is, of adab, reveals the intense competition between cultural brokers competing for cultural authority. And I guess I should stop here.